I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're about to hear a chapter of my ongoing sword and sorcery serial. Each week, without fail, I write a brand new chapter, and then I record it in one single, flawless take. It picks up right where we left off last time, so if this is your first episode and you want to know exactly what's going on, you might want to start back at the beginning. This is a fine place to start too, though, and if you want, you can always go back to catch up on what you missed. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 29. Maul bellowed out commands, and his subjects, the savage halflings of Cliffhome, scrambled to obey. Men, women, and children, they picked up weapons, they let out their shrill battle cries, and they rushed into the fray. They unsheathed swords, they lowered spears, they came to terms with their own mortality, and they charged headlong into it. Maul was a warrior born. The blood of 1,000 generations of strife and combat pumped through his veins. If he was to be threatened, if his person, if his people, if his belongings, if his possessions, if what was rightfully his was to be threatened, then he had no qualms about facing it head on, about diving forward, swinging his cudgel in wide, ferocious arcs, and not stopping until he was victorious or dead. But still, was he not a king? He was a king. He was the god king of the savage halflings. He was the one true king of men. And what was the point of being a king, of being a god, if you could not issue commands, if you could not have others labor for your benefit? Maul wasn't just born a warrior. He was born a king. The rightful king, the fated, destined monarch of a great civilization. He deserved loyalty. He deserved obedience. He deserved power. And what's more, he had earned it. By his sweat, his blood, and his tears, by his mistreatment, by his exploitation, by the torture that he suffered under the High Elves, under the Pharaoh, the filthy residents of that nameless city, the Dream Hunter Traum, under the Stone God, and under him. Had Maul not suffered enough? Had he not been through enough? Had he not worked hard enough? Sacrificed enough? He wasn't just a king by right. He was a king by virtue of what he had done, what he had accomplished in spite of all that had been placed in his way, in spite of the gods themselves conspiring against him. Maul was a king. So, as a king, he ordered his subjects into battle. With Xylan staring slack-jawed next to him, with SKALD cowering uncharacteristically behind him, Maul let his rage boil up unhindered. He drew upon his suffering, the mistreatment that seemed to be his destiny, drew upon the righteous fury of a man wronged, a man repeatedly deprived of what was rightfully his. He pulled out the sword, the sharp, cutting edge of circumstance, of luck, of his star-crossed fate, the one that had been used to run him through, piercing his heart, impaling his very soul, again and again, time after time. He held it high in the air, and he urged the halflings on to battle. The halflings had protected Cliffhome for generations. For as long as anyone in the border realm had kept histories of their world's savage, uncivilized tribes. They had repelled malicious fairies, dull-witted giants, avaricious dwarves, arrogant elves, and more spasming, explosive, unstable human civilizations than they could count. But what they attempted to repel now was something different, something horrible and unspeakable. The Feldrun, The Feldron. The Feldron, so terrible, an unnatural abomination, a mockery of all that is good and pure, an insult to all that lives and breathes. The Feldron. So abhorrent that even Xylan, the godless monk for whom all of existence was a joke, a grim gag, a macabre jest, so vile that even he was stunned into silence, so odious that even Skog, the fearsome cat beast for whom all the earth was divided into two categories, Maul and prey, so loathsome that she cowered, shivered, and for the first time, she felt true fear. But Maul stood proudly. Not because he didn't feel the fear, the terror, the indescribable horror, but because he didn't care. He stared straight ahead, barking orders as Cliffhome became a battlefield, shouting commands as that battlefield became an abattoir. But he didn't watch the fight. No, his gaze was held by something else. Maul, the one true king of men, watched that thing, the Feldron, making profane eye contact with the monster's blasphemous excuses for eyes. Maul watched the halflings, fearless, secure in the knowledge that if they were to die, they would go to their graves in the service of their god king, the stone god's avatar. He watched as they ran forward and were confronted by that invading detestation, that foul monstrosity, watched as they were confronted by the Feldron, and shortly thereafterward by the inky black void of nothingness. Many of the halflings didn't even make it to the Feldron before they collapsed on the ground, convulsing, limbs gone rigid, foam bubbling up from their mouths. The sight of the Feldron, of something so unnatural, of something so profane, was enough to strike those simple creatures down, their minds and bodies racked with merciless seizures. The ground was littered with tiny, spasming bodies, men, women, and children alike, for all of Cliffhome was responsible for the village's defense. The remaining halflings rushed ahead, leaping over their fallen brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. They were the halflings with enough mental fortitude to withstand the Feldron's nauseating, otherworldly appearance. The ones who didn't know enough of their world to know that what they faced was not of it. The ones taken enough by their religious fervor to be able to combat that perfect expression of the unholy. The ones with nothing left to lose. And perhaps the ones who were too stupid to know the odds they faced, or stupid enough to think that they could beat them. The Feldron tore through them, shifting and changing, growing arms to smash, legs to kick, claws to rend, and teeth to tear. It made no sense. It was impossible to understand. A battle that could not be followed, could not be predicted. The Feldron was in multiple places at once. It was nowhere at all. The halflings fell before they were struck, and they rose up fully healed, only to be ripped limb from limb. It pained Maul. It made his broken mind ache. But still, he watched. Maul's ears filled with the yells of charging halflings, with the screams of the dying, and with the gurgles of the warriors convulsing on the ground. But through it all, there was one noise that he couldn't tune out, no matter how hard he tried. One noise that was nearly inaudible, but rang out like thunder. One noise that surrounded him while echoing inside his very skull. The voice. The grating, terrible voice that repeated itself over and over again. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Maul watched as the halflings bled, cried out, and died, ignobly, drawing their final breaths covered in mud, blood and filth. He watched their weapons slice harmlessly through the Feldron, failing to make any mark on the foul substance that was its unknowable essence. Watched as those pitiful creatures failed to put a stop to the invader, failed to impede its progress, failed to prevent it from drawing closer, closer, ever closer to their king. He watched as they failed to do as their king had commanded. The one true king of men looked out upon that massacre, upon the charnel house the halfling village had become. He looked out upon the carnage he had commanded, the slaughter he had decreed his subjects to walk willingly into. He gazed on the blood, the gore, and the viscera of the savage halflings, given up to defend their god-king, to defend him. He looked upon their sacrifice, and he knew one thing. He knew one single thing with absolute, unwavering confidence. His subjects, the halflings, were useless. Useless! Absolutely, utterly useless! And why should he be surprised? Why should he ever be surprised? When had he been able to rely upon anyone for anything? The parents that failed to protect him from abduction, the elves that bound him to the world tree, the girl who stood by and watched them, that smile and those antlers and his unreliable deals and bargains, the addict who ushered him into addiction, the drug dealer who would exploit him, the pharaoh who would turn him into a walking weapon, and these halflings, these useless, stupid little beasts who would pledge their allegiance, would beg for his blessing, for his protection, knowing full well that they could do nothing to help him. Maul's body began to shake. He clenched his eyes shut and he shook his head. No, this was his problem. Maul knew what he deserved. He knew what he had earned, what he had sacrificed, what he had given up, what he had forsaken. He wasn't a smart man, and he knew it, but he was smart enough to know what was rightfully his. The problem wasn't anything he had done or anything he had failed to do. No, the problem, the real problem, the only problem Maul had ever had, was everyone else. Weak, frail, cowardly, fragile, and prone to, no, destined to fail utterly, time and again. Inconsistent, worthless hunks of meat, devoid of fortitude or constitution, lacking even a spine to hold their soft, quivering flesh upright. Maul had tried to do things on his own, but he hadn't been perfect. It's true, he had relied on others in the past. He had done it too much and always to his detriment. There was only one thing he could get reliably from other people. Disappointment. Even now, as he watched his soldiers, his warriors, his subjects fail him, he stood with his companions, Xylan and Skog. And what, pray tell, did they do? The godless monk, Maul's only friend, the one he had commanded his witch doctors to fix, to heal at all cost, what did he do? He stood there, eyes glazed over, mouth open, doing nothing. As useless as the halflings writhing in their death throes. More useless, because at least the halflings had tried to slow the Feldron down. And Skog. What of Skog? What of the fearsome cat beast, his pet, the one whom he had guarded and protected as a cub, the one for whom he stole food from the elven kitchens, risking capture and punishment and worse, just to keep her fed? Without him, where would she be? Nowhere. But where was she now? Cowering behind him like a mewling kitten, useless in the face of that trembling, shambling, mumbling terror, useless in the face of the Feldron. His subjects? Useless. His friends? Useless. So who could he depend on? Who could he rely upon to solve his problems? To solve any problem? What would he do when confronted with an atrocity so abominable as to threaten his very existence, his very sanity? What would he do when surrounded by nothing but weakness and cowardice? He would do what he always did. What he always must do. He would do the thing that would find him success, power, and glory, or else send him, finally, mercifully, into the waiting arms of that inky black void of nothingness. So he did it. He did the only thing he could do. He raised his cudgel, put one foot in front of the other, and he fought. Maul crashed into the Feldron, leaping off the ground just before impact, smashing his shoulder low on the monster's bulky form. He hoped to take it off its misshapen, impossible feet, knowing that it could simply grow more wherever, whenever it wished, but hoping, praying, needing to believe that if he could just roll it over, he could find an opening, a soft underbelly, an Achilles heel, somewhere he could strike and begin dismantling this outrageous obscenity. But when Maul collided with the Feldron, he didn't hear the monster cry out. He didn't hear a surprised roar or an agonized howl. All he heard was what he had heard since the battle first began, what he felt he had always heard, had always bounced around inside his skull. A tormented, scratchy voice that repeated over and over again. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Maul clambered up on top of the monster. He tried to target its head, but when he realized he couldn't pinpoint it, if the thing even had a head, he simply began attacking. He swung his cudgel down, connecting with the thick ooze that passed for the Feldron's flesh, sinking into its body with a stomach-churning noise, but causing no noticeable damage. He swung with his left arm, but his punches were no more effective than his cudgel. Still swinging his notched, blackened club, he began to claw at the beast's eye, but every time he dug his fingers in, the eye receded away from him, slid through the monster's translucent body, and rose again, elsewhere. It was no use. Maul kicked and kneed, punched and slapped, scratched and dug, head-butted and bit. He could taste the monster's foul essence on his lips. It made his gums sting and retreat from his tongue, but none of it was any use. The Feldron would not be deterred. It would not be turned back. So with Maul tiring, with his punches slowing, his kicks becoming weaker, his cudgel no longer connecting with the force it once held, the Feldron went on the attack. The monstrosity wrapped a lumpen, unnatural limb around Maul and pulled him close. Maul gasped as the breath was pressed out of him. The Feldron seemed to know exactly where to squeeze, how to force every last bit of air up out of Maul's lungs. Maul struggled for breath. He felt his ribs crack. He saw the darkness creep in along the edges of his vision, but that wasn't what frightened him. That wasn't what truly terrified him. No, the pain was excruciating, but he had felt that before, had felt worse, far worse, but he had clenched his teeth and muscled through it, just like he always did. The threat of death? Please. Maul had spent time in the roiling underneath, had been tormented by him, his gleaming smile, and his haunting antlers. Nothing in the inky black void of nothingness could ever be worse than that. No. What terrified Maul, what horrified him, what shook him to his very core, was what the Feldron said to him. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. The same words, the same line, the same intonation and tone, the same scratchy, terrible voice that refused to stop haunting his eardrums. The Feldrin held him close, burning his skin with his eldritch touch, and it whispered in his ears, louder than any cannon, and when Maul heard it, he knew the truth. He wasn't good enough. And now, he never would be. For all his bluster, for all his confidence, his pride, his arrogance, Maul was suddenly confronted with the truth of the matter. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the best. He certainly wasn't the smartest, the kindest, or the most talented. He was nothing. He was insignificant. An insect, a ripple in the waters of history, soon to wear itself out and be forgotten. He was nothing. Maul knew that he couldn't beat the Feldrin. He knew that he couldn't even survive its assault, because he knew that the words the Feldrin spoke weren't wrong, that the meaning they carried was true. Maul had fought and scraped and murdered and stolen and done whatever he could, but now he knew the truth. It had all been for nothing. Nothing. Maul knew that he was strong. Stronger than average. Stronger than most. He knew he was powerful. He lived by a code, held to it with an unwavering dedication. He did what he thought. No, what he knew to be right. But the Feldrin showed him the truth. It wasn't enough. None of it was enough. Maul was strong, but he wasn't strong enough. He commanded great power, but it wasn't great enough. He held to a code, but it was deficient, broken, a sign of a deficient, broken, weak, powerless little man, a sign of the little boy that Maul always feared that he still was, the little boy inside of him, the little boy he hated, but that he knew still guided his every motion out of something worse than rage, worse than hate, out of fear. Maul's entire life had been lived in fear. Fear of the elves, fear of abandonment, fear of pain, of having what was his taken away, of not being good enough, strong enough to get it back. And as a result, he had done awful, terrible things. He had worked hard, he had sacrificed, but worked hard at what? What had he sacrificed? He had sacrificed all that is good in life. He had worked hard at creating destruction, at spreading misery, anguish, and suffering. And worst of all, it had gotten him nothing. Nothing. Where was he now? Was he on his throne? Was he on the other throne? The one that had been given to him? Was he spending time with his friends? Did he even have friends? Could he enjoy the company of a woman he loved? Did he even know love? Had he forsaken that too? He had given up everything for his throne, the throne he would never sit upon, the one he wasn't strong enough to take back. He had given up everything for nothing. Maul couldn't breathe. He couldn't expand his chest enough to pull in air, but even beyond that, he didn't want to. What was the point? What was the point in anything? He had failed. He was a failure. He had a goal that he could never achieve, and in its pursuit, he had thrown everything else away. He was disgusting. Foul, an abomination upon the earth, a shambling mess who existed only to spread disgust and terror. His eyes lolled back into his head, and though there was no breath left in him to drive it, his lips parted and he spoke in a scratchy, terrible, wounded voice. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Maul was breathless, but he wept. His body heaving, tears streaming down his face. He wept for what he'd done, what he hadn't done, what he'd had taken from him, and most of all, he wept for his failure, the crushing, unmitigated failure that his entire life had been. He closed his eyes, but the tears still forced their way out as he waited patiently for the only reward he had left, the only reward he had ever had. The inky black void of nothingness. Imagine Maul's surprise then, when the crushing, stinging, hateful grip of the Feldron released him. Maul fell to the ground in a crumpled heap, still clutching the cudgel, that blackened branch of the world tree. The worn, burnt club had been his life raft in the roiling underneath, and now it had saved him once again, allowing him to fight off the loathing of the Feldron just long enough for that cackling, godless monk to take action. You know what? Xylan laughed sardonically. You are sorry. The godless monk had inched forward as Maul fought with the Feldron, and he had struck the beast with a staff, a simple length of wood that he had found lying on the ground. Xylan knew the powers of the Feldron. He had seen them firsthand, but he also knew something else. The beast was not something unto itself, was not a force that existed outside of itself. It was something pieced together, constructed and summoned up by mortals. Just like the gods that Xylan refused to heed, revere, or even acknowledge. The Feldron wasn't a god. So Xylan knew that he couldn't bring his full powers to bear upon it, but as a construct, as a fictional being conjured into existence by mortal flesh, Xylan did know that he could hurt it. So with all his might, channeling everything he had learned from his former masters, summoning up the power that he had nurtured by rejecting their order, Xylan struck the Feldron, and for a brief, miraculous moment, that heaving monster did something it had never done before. It retreated. The Feldron dropped Maul, reared back, and gasped, shocked and horrified that it was capable of not just causing pain and suffering, but feeling it as well. It threw back what passed for its head, and it cried out, "I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry." Xylan's attack upon the Feldron was little more than a distraction, and the Feldron was already steadying itself. But that brief moment was all that Maul's companion, his pet, his oldest friend, had needed. It was all the time that SKALD had needed to seize Maul, seize the savage brute that she so loved, and rescue him from the quickly recovering Feldron. As the massive cat beast dragged him away, Maul opened his eyes and took in the scene. The ground was littered, covered really, with the bodies of fallen halflings. Some crawling for safety they wouldn't find, but most dead or close to it. Meanwhile, the godless monk spun and cackled, distracting the Feldron, giving SKALD the precious moments she needed to get Maul to safety. Maul heard the moans of the dying halflings, and he heard the screams of his harem, his nighttime attendants, the stone god's sacrifice, Suana and Bellbricks, as he used the stone altar, the very one they were tied to push himself up. My king, please, free us, let us loose, we'll do anything, please." They wept and they cried and they fought against their ropes, but Maul ignored them. Ignored them because he heard something else. Something else rattled around in his ears. That scratchy, wounded, sorrowful, awful voice. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. Maul averted his eyes. He looked away from the two halfling girls, the ones he had used and then cast away, the ones he had sentenced to death in order to get what he wanted. He scowled and looked down as he searched through his leather jerkin, as his hand crept to the small, hidden inner pocket, the one he had asked the halfling tailors to make for him. He slid his fingers in, and he grasped it. The only hope he had, the only thing that could save him, could get him away from the Feldrin. He grasped it, and he grinned. The savage brute spared a glance back at the Feldrin. The monster had tired of Xylan's distractions, and it swatted the godless monk aside. He lay upon the ground, not moving, weak, vulnerable, but that was a decision to be made later. For now, Maul saw a problem, and he saw a solution. All that there was left to do was to climb. Maul leapt at the stone god and began scrambling up it. Being twice their size, he had an easier time than the halflings had, but it was a chore nonetheless, especially as he was still tormented by what the Feldrin had told him, had shown him. He was tormented by the truth that he wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, that he had accomplished nothing. No. He had to climb for the same reason he had to do anything. Because there was no other choice. There was nowhere else for him to go. He hoisted himself up, straddled the stone god's shoulder, and shoved the tiny, glimmering stone into its mouth. The flash was blinding, both outside and inside Maul's head. Instinctively, he threw himself clear from the rumbling statue. He landed hard, ungracefully, but there was no time for injury, for weakness. Maul winced and looked up just in time to see the stone giant stretch its arms, blink its eyes, and roar a painful, agonizing scream. Granite homunculus brought its hands to its face as gravel and rubble fell from its joints, raining down upon Maul. Maul, you ignorant, stupid beast! It spoke in a voice that hurt to hear, and likely hurt even more to speak. What have you done? The savage brute pushed himself to his feet, and he grinned. I did what I promised. I gave you a body. Traum. Normally, at the end of each episode of SKALD, I implore you to leave the show a review on iTunes, and then I read one of the reviews that's already there. But this week, I've got something far, far, far more important to do. I need to say thank you to Craig Brennan. Craig is one of the folks who's been generous enough to support SKALD on Patreon, which has earned him this very shout out. It's because of people like Craig that I'm able to keep going with SKALD. Keep going forever, hopefully. If you enjoy SKALD and you want it to continue, please head over to patreon.com/SKALD. It's safe, secure, and easy. And by pledging a small monthly donation, you can get rewards like free ebooks, Twitter follows, and shoutouts. If you haven't picked it up already, and you're not a Patreon donor who got it for free, the SKALD volume ebook is still only $2.99. Exclusively on Amazon. Volume 2 is going to be released in just a little bit more than a month. So go ahead and pick up the first mind-blowing volume now to get ready for it. And make sure to leave a good review when you do. I am on all of your favorite social networks. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr, they're all Aubrey Sitterson. It's super easy. Or, even easier, head over to AubreySitterson.com, where I have links to everything, including all my social media, SKALD, the SKALD ebook, my comics writing work, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, bio, contact information, and more. Are you watching Narcos? If you have Netflix, you should probably be watching Narcos. I was skeptical at first. I felt like the 80s drug story had been done to death, and honestly, I was kind of put off by how derivative of Goodfellas the whole thing seemed at first. But by the end of the pilot, the very first episode, I was hooked. It's a smartly written, beautiful-looking show with great characterization. Just come prepared for some difficult-to-make-out subtitles, and you will be ready to go. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.